resources become the key motivators that force many species to continue the search elsewhere for more food, more space, more cargo, and in this particular case, extend the empire. Most draconian expeditions rarely moved far from the Empiric fleets, but have on occasion wandered independently and unmolested into open space. The lack of information about their search criteria at this point is significant. It is unclear as to what resources are unique and necessary to the Seacar, or if this type of operation is simply a tactical move. Yet these expeditionary units are constantly operating. One particular expeditionary group was empirically directed over the far outer Perseus arm, and especially into the far reaches of the Orion arm, that up until now had not even been physically mapped. This area, for all intents and purposes, was completely unrestricted space and free for the taking. This flight entered an as yet uncharted system on the far outer tendril of the Orion arm and began their mapping, analysis, and the constant eyeing of potentials for colonization. The outer planets were gaseous, icy, cold, and offered no real potential. Of the many simple moons accompanying these bodies, there were none that showed a credible or worthy expense of time or study. As was usual for these operations, the telemetry and structural details of the system were recorded nonetheless. After pausing at the fourth planet for quite some time, it was determined the planet could be colonized, though not optimally, so a colony outpost was placed here to initially claim the system. There was no real intrinsic value to the planet, though it could provide an excellent central location as either a scientific or military installation. At this time, the planet contained a fairly thin atmosphere, some minor water systems, but relatively simple ore fields of no intrinsic value. Because of the extremely isolated nature of this system, and since there was no other nearby traffic remotely detected, it is felt that the request of further fleet support was not required at this time. The remainder of the expedition continued on. The third planet was thick with atmosphere and abundant life forms of both plants and animals. A little too much briny water for draconian needs, but under the circumstances, this looked really fascinating. In their ancient memories, the predating discoveries found most planets with little or few components of necessity. But never before in Empire history had such a planet ever been located, containing the variety that this one promised. There was considerable and ample mineralogy, with a myriad of ore in vast deposits and a solid component magnetic field to sustain a thick atmosphere with tolerable climate. The system is designated Sol. The fourth planet is named Mar. The third planet is called Terra. Whether or not these designations were created by the Draconians or some other race before or since is currently unknown. To this day, those names remain even to the current inhabitants. The Draconians begin the task at hand, as now their foothold here belongs to the Empire. The installation on Mar is constructed in some haste and relatively shallow, and since no surface facility is required, they fairly isolate themselves to this one location. Built into the extremely soft surface material between the equator and the northern pole, the facility contains a relatively small contingent of Seacar. They would also act as a support point to Terra, and communications back to the Empire were most likely sent from here. The primary colony installation on Terra is built into an optimal central position on the large target continent in the soft substrata, which would allow for ease of fairly quick assembly. Though the facility's position is relatively deep, there are the beginnings of an existent, already long-running cave system which would allow ease of access to the surface. There are a few reasonably sturdy outposts built on the surface in differing locations across the planet to better perform their task for the proposed mission. In the usual draconian manner, the surface labs are connected to the main colony installation by subsurface tunnels. Though obviously draconians prefer the subsurface realm, this particular project will require above-ground facilities, and via these interconnecting tunnels, they can regain some form of comfort and ongoing supply when necessary. As often happens in the widely variable possibilities of planetary life forms, Terra was no different. Several types of marine species were evident, and these ranged from the smallest microscopic organisms up to a few fairly good-sized aquatic predators. The types of land-based species were not as prevalent as the sea life, though these too showed the basis for potentially growing numbers given the state of both the atmosphere and the available surface plant life, which at this time was notably swampy and highly provocative. The thick vegetation also provided other ecological byproducts which would support the current surface life. At this time, there were absolutely no signs of any civilization, and therefore no potential obstruction to their activities existed here. The only thing remotely close to a civilization, as far as could be ascertained by the sea car, was a land-based microscopic organism, which had successfully managed to convert sunlight to useful energy and nutrition. For obvious reasons, they would not at this time present a serious threat. There were a few relatively interesting types of very early to intermediate stages of reptiles currently referred to as stem reptiles, which were the early Terran snakes and lizards. There was a growing preponderance as well of a variety of aquatic reptiles and some of the earliest incarnations of what are called turtles and the like. It was about this time as well that some seriously rudimentary mammals were just beginning to appear. There were also an assortment of some early birds, though these appeared to be of some oddly reptile origin which at this time can only be guessed. But for all this expansive variety, there was one species group which also showed intensely interesting promise. In Terran terms, they are currently referred to as the early archosaurs, which were an incarnation of some arbitrary reptilian evolutionary branch, whose divergence from the existing path of reptiles placed them into a unique and favorable position as far as the sea car were concerned. Some of these unique reptiles showed the definitive and necessary predilection to predatory adaptation. A few even appeared to lean towards the beginnings of a pack-hunting mentality, rather than being individually rogue in nature, as was usual for reptiles, early or otherwise. This behavior attracted the attention of the sea car analysts almost immediately. Collection of groups of these reptile species began, and in a very short time it became readily plausible that these should prove to be stable for their goals. In the early millennia of the hybridization project, once selected groups of viable subjects were achieved, the initial results were released into the wild for study. Some hybrids showed signs of promise. Others were in essence dead ends due to returning to the undesirable rogue nature or being killed off too quickly. Other failures that appeared from this experiment simply did not offer much promise for further advancement as predominantly passive herbivores, though these too would suit a later purpose, so were allowed to continue for now. As more of these successful new hybrid species became satisfactorily viable in the wild, it was decided not to necessarily allow for long-term evolutionary growth, and at this point, further manipulation was necessary. this began the foundations for a very surprising empiric enterprise. Selective groups of the hybrid reptiles were brought in, and additional steps for growth and specific genomic changes were made that began to produce rather immense and extremely predatory versions of the originals. There were many successes, though it was also determined that due to the nature and size of these newer hybrids, that a more stable food source would be required than the existing surface life could currently support. The decision was made to continue the same growth manipulations with several non-predatory species in order to perpetuate the new predaceous subjects. Once a sort of fluid balance was achieved, the surface began to be sufficiently populated with an incredible array of these massive reptiles. These escalating successes in hybrid speciation were almost to the point of absurdity. Though even with this type of success, the observable outcomes did not appear to provide anything with the desired intelligence. The predatory subjects had become quite large, strong, fast, and extremely agile, though any meager thoughts of control and direction were out of the question. There were some experiments conducted with attempts at manipulation of intelligence, though in the few cases that remained viable, outright control or even limited training was still near impossible. Though the draconian researchers had attained a modicum of communicative understanding between themselves and the new hybrids, the seeming refusal to follow direction by the most difficult test subjects would have proved disastrous. In a few cases, it would have become necessary to physically remove certain failures. There were in some cases death pits made, where the researchers simply ended such failures, either due to turning on the researchers or, as a matter of course, from undesirable genetic flaws. In some rare cases, the superior's orders from the main colony facility called for immediate cessation of certain directions in the experiment, so a few unique variations were likewise disposed of in this manner. The lessons garnered through the manipulations were beginning to compile quite a study for the C-car. These experiments continued over time, and as the global population of these reptiles increased through natural selection and further hybridization, outward appearances seemed to show vast successes, though an ultimate inability to timely perfect the desired results. It could have been they were contemplating using a specific species as the focus of their efforts, as their preferences in this regard directly related to their own social and obvious military predilections. But they were getting closer and closer with every step, and the results were relayed as such to Draconis. It appeared on the surface that mission success was finally and vastly attainable. If they could succeed in this particular endeavor, the Draconian Empire would literally have a huge and easily replenished army on a massive scale, unlike anything seen before or since. This would in essence relieve them of the necessary C-car losses should they face further confrontations. Time would tell, and the C-car appeared to have plenty of that on their hands.